You can't stay here. The words cut through the mountain air like a blade, weary and final. Three women stood at the threshold of his cabin, their wedding dresses torn and muddied, faces streaked with tears and determination. The tallest one, auburn hair escaping her veil, lifted her chin defiantly. "Then where exactly do you suggest we go, Sheriff Morrison?" His jaw tightened at the title he tried so hard to forget. "It's just Caleb now, and that's not my problem." But even as he spoke those harsh words, something in their desperate eyes reminded him of another woman, another time, another choice he'd failed to make. The blonde one swayed on her feet, exhaustion written in every line of her body. The dark-haired girl couldn't be more than 19, clutching a carpet bag like her life depended on it. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. "Please," the auburn-haired woman whispered, and that single word shattered something inside his chest he'd thought was already broken beyond repair. 3 months earlier, Caleb Morrison had been the respected sheriff of Millfield Creek, a man with a badge, a purpose, and a future. Now he stood in the doorway of a crude mountain cabin, facing three runaway brides who'd somehow found their way to his exile, and wondering how the hell his carefully constructed solitude had just crumbled to dust. The wind howled through the pines behind them, carrying the scent of snow and something else, the unmistakable smell of men on horseback, still distant but coming closer. Whatever these women were running from, it was following them up his mountain. And Caleb Morrison, no matter how hard he tried to bury the lawman inside him, still recognized the look of prey being hunted. The story of how three desperate women found their way to Caleb Morrison's mountain hideaway began with a single telegram that changed everything. "Marshall Dixon requests your immediate resignation. Stop corruption charges pending. Stop, leave Millfield Creek by sunset stop." Caleb had stared at those words for a full minute before crumpling the yellow paper and tossing it into the fireplace. 20 years wearing a badge, 20 years of protecting a town that had welcomed him as an orphaned boy, and it all ended with 32 words from a corrupt federal marshal who'd been bought and paid for by cattle baron Raymond Blackwood. The setup had been perfect, too perfect. Evidence planted in his office, witness testimony from men who'd never met him, financial records that painted him as just another lawman with his hand in the wrong pocket. Blackwood wanted the mineral rights to the land around Millfield Creek, and Sheriff Morrison had been the only obstacle standing in his way. So Caleb had packed his saddlebags, holstered his Colt, and ridden into the Colorado mountains without looking back. He'd found this abandoned trapper's cabin, 3 days hard ride from civilization, patched the roof, chinked the walls, and settled into a life of deliberate solitude. For 3 months, his only companions had been the wind in the pines and his own bitter thoughts. He'd grown a beard, let his hair go long, and almost convinced himself he preferred this exile to the complications of town life. Almost. Then came that October morning when he'd stepped outside to split firewood and found three women collapsed beside his well. The auburn-haired one, who'd introduced herself as Jenny Whitman, had done most of the talking. She was the school teacher from Millfield Creek, though she'd never mentioned knowing him when he was sheriff. The blonde was Margaret O'Brien, daughter of the town banker, and the youngest was Elena Santos, whose father owned the largest mercantile in 3 counties. All three had been arranged to marry Raymond Blackwood's business associates in a triple wedding ceremony that would have sealed several lucrative deals. All three had chosen to run instead. "We heard about the cabin from old Pete Garrison at the livery," Jenny had explained, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "He said there was a place up the mountain where a man could disappear if he needed to." What Pete hadn't mentioned was that the man who disappeared had been the very sheriff who'd once protected their town. Now, as darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Caleb found himself in an impossible position. His instincts screamed at him to send them away, to protect the isolation he'd built around his wounded heart. But another part of him, the part that had worn a badge for 2 decades, couldn't ignore the fear in their voices when they'd mentioned Blackwood's men pursuing them. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the canyon below, growing closer with each passing minute. The decision to let them stay wasn't really a decision at all. It was survival instinct kicking in when Caleb spotted the torches moving up the mountainside. Inside. Now. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and the three women didn't hesitate. Jenny helped steady Margaret, who was clearly running on nothing but determination, while Elena clutched her carpet bag tighter and cast nervous glances toward the approaching lights. Caleb's cabin was sparse but functional. One main room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping alcove barely big enough for his cot, and a small kitchen area with supply to last the winter. It definitely wasn't designed for 4 people, especially when 3 of them were wearing torn wedding gowns. "How many men?" Jenny asked, moving to peer out the single window. 6, maybe 7. Caleb was already checking his weapons, 2 Colts, a Winchester rifle, and a shotgun he kept by the door. "You ladies know how to shoot?" The question earned him 3 very different responses. Jenny nodded grimly, Margaret looked terrified, and Elena surprised him by producing a small derringer from somewhere in her skirts. "Papa insisted I learn," she said with a slight Spanish accent. "Said a merchant's daughter needed to protect herself." The riders were close enough now that Caleb could hear individual voices carried on the wind. He recognized the gravelly tone of Bull Hensley, one of Blackwood's hired guns, and felt his jaw tighten. These weren't men who'd give up easily. "Listen carefully," he said, turning to face the women. "There's a root cellar beneath that trap door by the fireplace. If things go bad, you get down there and stay quiet until I come for you." "What about you?" Jenny's green eyes held a steadiness that reminded him why he'd always respected the school teachers. They faced crisis with clear heads. "I'm going to convince them you were never here." The hoofbeats stopped just outside, followed by the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs. Caleb motioned for silence and moved to the door, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Morrison!" Bull's voice carried the arrogance of a man who'd never been told no. "We know you're in there. We're looking for 3 women, runaway brides who stole horses from the Blackwood Ranch. You seen them?" Caleb opened the door just wide enough to show himself, keeping his body blocking the view inside. "Haven't seen anybody up here but you boys. Mountain's a big place. They probably took the northern pass toward Denver." Bull dismounted, his 6 companions staying mounted but ready. He was a big man with cruel eyes and scarred knuckles, the kind of enforcer who enjoyed his work too much. "Funny thing, Morrison, or should I say, former Sheriff Morrison." Bull's grin was ugly in the torchlight. "Mr. Blackwood thought you might be sympathetic to these ladies, seeing as how you've got your own grudge against him." "I don't have a grudge against anybody. I just want to be left alone." "See, that's where we have a problem." Bull took a step closer, his hand drifting toward his gun. "Because tracks say otherwise. 3 horses ridden hard up this mountain. Tracks that lead right to your door." Caleb's mind raced. The women had mentioned stealing horses, but in the chaos of their arrival, he hadn't thought to check for pursuing riders following their trail. Amateur mistake, the kind that got people killed. "Like I said," Caleb replied evenly, "haven't seen anybody. You're welcome to look around if you want, but you won't find anything." Bull's eyes narrowed. "Think I'll take you up on that offer." That's when the shooting started. The first shot wasn't from Bull Hensley's gun, it was from Elena Santos, who'd positioned herself at the window with her derringer and put a bullet through the shoulder of the rider, trying to circle around behind the cabin. All hell broke loose in the space of a heartbeat. Caleb dove to his left as Bull drew iron, rolling behind the woodpile just as bullets started flying. The women scattered, Jenny dragging Margaret toward the root cellar, while Elena reloaded with practiced efficiency that spoke of more experience than she'd let on. "You lying son of a bitch!" Bull roared, firing wild shots that splintered the cabin door. "I knew you had them!" Caleb came up with his Winchester, picking his targets carefully. These weren't lawmen, they were hired guns with no legal authority, which meant he could put them down without losing sleep over it. His first shot took the rider Elena had wounded clean out of the saddle. His second sent another man diving for cover behind his horse. "Jenny," he called over the gunfire, "can you use that rifle by the fireplace?" "I can try." Her voice came from near the trap door, steady despite the chaos. A bullet whined past his ear, close enough to remind him why he'd never enjoyed gunfights. Bull and his remaining men had spread out, using their horses and the darkness for cover. The smart play would have been to surround the cabin and wait for dawn, but Bull had always been more muscle than brains. Jenny appeared at the other window with his spare rifle, and Caleb felt a surge of admiration when she immediately started laying down covering fire. Her shots were measured and accurate. This wasn't her first time in a shooting scrape. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" he called. "My father was a cavalry officer." She worked the lever action smoothly, sending another rider scrambling for cover. "He said proper ladies should know more than embroidery." The battle settled into a deadly pattern, Bull's men trying to rush the cabin, while Caleb and Jenny kept them pinned down. Elena had disappeared into the root cellar with Margaret, which was smart tactical thinking. The fewer people exposed to gunfire, the better. But Caleb knew they couldn't hold this position indefinitely. He had plenty of ammunition, but Bull's men could keep them trapped until reinforcements arrived. And if Blackwood was as connected as he suspected, those reinforcements might include federal marshals with actual legal authority. That's when he noticed the smell of smoke. "Clever bastards," he muttered, seeing the orange glow starting to flicker near the back of the cabin. While they'd been focused on the frontal assault, someone had circled around and set fire to the back wall. "Jenny, we've got fire!" She turned from the window, saw the growing glow, and her face went pale. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 10 minutes before this whole place goes up." Caleb made a quick count of the remaining riders. 4 men, plus Bull, all positioned between them and the horses they'd need to escape. "I'm going out there." "That's suicide." "Maybe, but it's better than burning alive." He checked his revolvers, making sure he had full cylinders. "When I start shooting, you get those women to the horses. Don't wait for me." Jenny's hand caught his arm as he moved toward the door. "Wait, there might be another way." She pointed toward the back wall, where the fire was starting to eat through the chinked logs. "My father used to say that sometimes the best escape route is the one your enemy doesn't expect." Caleb looked at the growing flames, then at Jenny's determined face, and suddenly understood what she was thinking. Going through the fire wasn't Jenny's craziest idea, but it ran a close second to agreeing to marry one of Blackwood's associates in the first place. "The back wall is mostly old chinked logs," she explained rapidly, already moving toward the growing flames. "If we can break through where the fires weakened the wood, we can get out while they're watching the front." Caleb grabbed a wet blanket from his wash basin, his mind racing through the tactical possibilities. Bull's men were positioned to cover the door and windows, but they wouldn't expect anyone to escape through a burning wall. "Elena! Margaret!" Jenny called toward the root cellar. "We're leaving through the back." The 2 women emerged, Elena still clutching her reloaded Derringer, while Margaret looked like she might faint at any moment. But there was steel in the banker's daughter that surprised Caleb. She might be terrified, but she wasn't giving up. "This is insane," Margaret whispered, staring at the flames. "Sanity is overrated," Elena replied, wrapping her shawl around her head. "I've always preferred living dangerously." Caleb kicked at the weakened logs, feeling them give way under the assault of fire in his boot heel. The opening would be tight, but manageable. Outside, he could hear Bull shouting orders to his men, growing impatient with the siege. "Ladies first," he said, helping Jenny through the hole they'd created. The flames singed the hem of her torn wedding dress, but she made it through without serious injury. Elena went next, nimble as a cat, followed by Margaret, who required some assistance from both Jenny and Elena, pulling her through. Caleb came last, beating out small fires on his jacket as he squeezed through the gap. They found themselves behind the cabin in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees. The horses Bull's men had been riding were visible through the trees, and beyond them, Caleb could see the 3 mounts the women had stolen from Blackwood's ranch. "Can you ride?" he asked Margaret, who was swaying on her feet. "I can ride," she said firmly. "I just need a horse." The nearest horse was 50 yards away through thick forest, guarded by one of Bull's men who was watching the cabin's front door. Caleb studied the situation, calculating angles and distances. "I'll take care of the guard," he whispered. "You 3 get to those horses and start riding. Head north toward the high pass. There's an old mining camp about 6 miles up the trail." "What about you?" Jenny's eyes searched his face in the flickering light from the burning cabin. "I'll catch up." It was a lie, and they both knew it. One man against four was suicide odds, even for someone with his experience. But it was the only play that gave the women a chance to escape. Jenny grabbed his arm. There has to be another way. Before Caleb could respond, Elena stepped forward with that dangerous gleam in her dark eyes. Actually, there is. Papa always said the best way to deal with bullies is to give them something they want more than what they're fighting for. She reached into her carpet bag and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. Blackwood's men aren't loyal. They're hired, and hired men can be bought by the highest bidder. Caleb stared at the bag of gold, then at Elena's determined face. How much? Enough to buy their loyalty, at least temporarily. The question is whether you trust me to negotiate with them. It was the craziest plan yet, but as Caleb listened to Bull's increasingly frustrated shouts, he realized it might be their only chance. The cabin's roof caught fire with a whoosh that lit up the entire mountainside. Elena Santos had learned negotiation from her father, but she'd learned survival from the streets of Santa Fe before her family struck it rich in the mercantile business. She walked into the firelight with her hands visible, the bag of gold coins clutched in her left hand, and her derringer nowhere to be seen. Bull Hensley turned at the sound of her approach, his eyes narrowing as he took in her torn wedding dress and soot-smudged face. Well, well, he drawled, lowering his gun but not holstering it. One of the runaway brides decides to show herself. I'm here to make a deal, Elena said, her voice carrying the confidence of a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted. Business, not bullets. Bull laughed, but Caleb could see the other men listening intently. Hired guns were always interested in better offers. You don't have anything I want, sweetheart. I have $500 in gold. Elena hefted the bag, letting the coins jingle. That's more than Blackwood is paying you for this job. The laughter died in Bull's throat. $500 was serious money, enough to live well for months or buy a small ranch. Caleb saw the calculation in the other men's eyes, saw them weighing loyalty against opportunity. Even if you're telling the truth, Bull said slowly, Blackwood would hunt us down for betraying him. Blackwood would never know. Elena's smile was dangerous and beautiful. You tell him we died in the fire. 3 bodies in a burned-in cabin, too charred to identify. He gets what he wants. No embarrassing runaway brides to complicate his business deals. From his hiding spot behind the trees, Caleb had to admire her style. The girl had brass, and she understood men like Bull better than they understood themselves. And what do we get besides the gold? Asked one of the other riders, a lean man with intelligent eyes. Freedom to leave Colorado with enough money to start over somewhere else. Clean slate, no questions asked. Bull was wavering, Caleb could see it. The man was a bully and a killer, but he wasn't stupid. $500 and a chance to disappear was better than loyalty to a boss who'd eventually discard him anyway. Prove you have the money, Bull demanded. Elena opened the bag and poured a handful of gold coins into her palm, letting them catch the firelight. The sight had an immediate effect on Bull's men. Greed was a powerful motivator. All right, Bull said finally, but I want to see all 3 of you. No tricks. That was Caleb's cue. He stepped out of the shadows with his hands visible but ready to draw, Jenny and Margaret flanking him. The tableau they presented, a disheveled former sheriff and 3 determined women, must have been something to see. $500, Elena repeated, for your word that we all walk away from here alive. Bull looked at his men, seeing the same hunger in their eyes that he felt. Make it $600 and you have a deal. Done. Elena tossed him the bag without hesitation. Now call off your dogs and let us ride out of here. Bull caught the bag, hefted it, and grinned. Pleasure doing business with you, Miss Santos. But Caleb caught the look that passed between Bull and his men, and his hand drifted closer to his gun. Men like Bull Hensley didn't honor deals. They honored opportunities. There's just one problem, Bull continued, his grin turning ugly. Mr. Blackwood specifically wanted proof that you ladies were dead, and I'm a man who keeps his word to his employer. The first shot came from Elena's hidden derringer, taking Bull center mass before he could draw his weapon. The smart money would have been on Bull's men scattering after their leader went down, but greed made men stupid, and $600 in gold made them downright reckless. The lean rider went for his gun first, fast and smooth, but Jenny's rifle cracked before he could clear leather. She'd positioned herself behind a tree while Elena was negotiating, using the distraction to get a better angle. Her bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying into the darkness. Margaret surprised everyone by producing a small pocket pistol and putting a hole through the hat of the man nearest her. Her hands were shaking, but her aim was steady enough to make her point. "I may be a banker's daughter," she said with quiet dignity, "but I'm nobody's victim." The remaining three riders found themselves facing four armed opponents in uncertain light, their leader dead, and their easy payday suddenly looking a lot more complicated. Caleb gave them credit for sense when they slowly raised their hands. "Smart choice," he said, keeping his Colt trained on the nearest man. "Now you're going to collect your dead, mount up, and ride back down this mountain. You're going to tell Blackwood exactly what Miss Santos suggested, that we all died in the fire." "And if we don't?" asked the lean rider, clutching his wounded shoulder. Elena stepped over Bull's body to retrieve her bag of gold, then pulled out a small notebook and pencil. "Then I write a letter to the territorial governor about federal marshals taking bribes from cattle barons. My father has connections, gentlemen, the kind that can make your lives very uncomfortable." She was bluffing, probably, but her confidence was convincing enough to make the survivors nervous. Caleb had to admire her style. The woman had ice water in her veins and a mind that worked 3 moves ahead. "We'll take the deal," the lean rider said finally. "But this don't end here. Blackwood ain't gonna just let this go." "Then maybe it's time to find new employment," Jenny suggested. "Men with your skills could make honest livings anywhere west of the Mississippi." It took 20 minutes to get the survivors loaded up and moving down the mountain. They took Bull's body slung across his saddle, and Caleb made sure to erase as many tracks as possible around the cabin site. The fire had done most of the work for them. The structure was now just charred timbers and ash. When the hoofbeats finally faded into the distance, the 4 of them stood looking at the ruins of Caleb's 3-month sanctuary. "I'm sorry," Jenny said quietly. "You lost everything because of us." Caleb kicked at the ashes where his bed used to be, then shrugged. "Wasn't much to lose. Besides, I was getting tired of talking to myself." "So what now?" Margaret asked. She'd found a fallen log to sit on and was examining her torn dress with the practical eye of a woman already planning her next move. That was the question, wasn't it? They couldn't go back to Millfield Creek. Blackwood's influence there was too strong. They couldn't stay on the mountain with winter coming. And Caleb was starting to realize that 3 months of solitude hadn't done much to heal the wounds that had driven him into exile. "There's a town called Cedar Ridge about 2 days' ride north," he said finally. "Small place, but far enough from Blackwood's reach that you ladies might be safe there." "What about you?" Elena asked, still holding her derringer like she expected more trouble. Caleb looked at the 3 women who'd turned his carefully ordered exile upside down in the space of a few hours. Jenny with her steady green eyes and quick thinking. Margaret with her quiet strength and hidden steel. Elena with her dangerous smile and practical ruthlessness. A smart man would wish them luck and ride in the opposite direction. A smart man would find another mountain, another cabin, another chance at the peace that had been eluding him for 3 months. But as he watched Jenny help Margaret to her feet and saw Elena pocket her weapon with the satisfied air of a job well done, Caleb Morrison realized he'd never been as smart as he'd thought. 2 days later, they rode into Cedar Ridge looking like exactly what they were. Refugees from someone else's war, carrying everything they owned in saddlebags and hope. The town was bigger than Caleb had expected, sprawling along both sides of a creek that ran clear and cold from the mountains. There was a main street with a hotel, a general store, a saloon, and what looked like a decent-sized church. Mountains rose on all sides, creating a natural fortress that had probably saved the town from more than one Indian raid. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, and Caleb could hear the relief in her voice. After 2 days of sleeping on hard ground and looking over their shoulders, even a frontier town looked like paradise. They'd learned things about each other during those 2 days that went beyond the basic facts. Jenny could cook over an open fire, track wounded game, and had once killed a rattlesnake with a shovel. Margaret knew more about banking and investments than most men, could calculate compound interest in her head, and had been secretly managing her father's books for 3 years. Elena spoke 4 languages, could pick locks, and had once bluffed her way out of a bandit camp in Mexico by convincing them she was a witch. None of them had asked Caleb about his past beyond the basic facts, which he appreciated. Some stories were better left buried. The Cedar Ridge Hotel was a 2-story building with clean windows and fresh paint, owned by a widow named Mrs. Catherine Flynn, who took one look at their traveling party and immediately assigned them rooms with the efficiency of a woman who'd seen everything twice. "You'll be wanting baths," she said, not making it a question, "and proper clothes. There's a seamstress 2 doors down who does good work quick." "We can pay," Jenny said, reaching for her small purse. "I'm sure you can, dear, but payment comes after you've gotten some rest and a hot meal." Mrs. Flynn's eyes were kind but sharp, taking in the details of their situation without judgment. "This town has a policy about helping folks who are running from something. We ask no questions for the first week." In his room that night, Caleb lay on a real bed for the first time in months and tried to figure out what came next. He had enough money saved to last through winter, but after that, he'd need work. His skills were limited. He could track, shoot, and keep order, but those weren't exactly peaceful professions. A soft knock on his door interrupted his brooding. Jenny stood in the hallway, wearing a simple blue dress that Mrs. Flynn had provided and looking more beautiful than any woman had a right to. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. He stepped aside to let her in, noting how her hair caught the lamplight. "Too many thoughts." "I know the feeling." She moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street. "I keep waiting for riders to come charging up the main street." "That won't happen. We covered our tracks well, and Bull's men have no reason to keep looking for dead women." Jenny turned from the window, studying his face. "You're planning to leave, aren't you?" The question caught him off guard, probably because it hit too close to the truth. "You don't need my protection anymore. You're safe here." "That's not what I asked." Caleb moved to join her at the window, close enough to catch the faint scent of soap and something essentially feminine. "I'm not the staying kind, Miss Whitman. Never have been." "Jenny, and I think that's where you're wrong." Her green eyes held his steadily. "I think you've been running from staying so long, you've forgotten what it feels like to belong somewhere." Before he could respond, another knock interrupted them, this time more urgent. Margaret stood in the hallway with Elena beside her, both fully dressed despite the late hour. "We have a problem," Margaret said quietly. "Mrs. Flynn just told us something we need to discuss." They gathered in Jenny's room where Mrs. Flynn waited with a grim expression and a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "I should have mentioned this earlier," the older woman began, "but I wanted to let you folks get settled first. We've been having trouble here in Cedar Ridge, the kind of trouble that might interest a former sheriff." Caleb felt his blood chill. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that involves cattle missing, businesses being pressured to sell, and federal marshals asking questions about mineral rights." Mrs. Flynn's eyes were steady. "The kind that sounds suspiciously like Raymond Blackwood's work, even though he's supposed to be 300 miles south of here." The meeting in Jenny's room stretched past midnight as Mrs. Flynn laid out the details of Cedar Ridge's troubles, and with each revelation, Caleb felt the familiar weight of a badge he no longer wore. "It started about 2 months ago," Mrs. Flynn explained, settling her coffee cup on the small table by the window. "Strangers started showing up, asking questions about who owned what land, which businesses were struggling, who might be interested in selling. Polite questions, mind you, but persistent." Elena leaned forward, her dark eyes sharp with interest. "What kind of strangers?" "Well-dressed men with Eastern accents and federal documents. They claimed to be conducting a territorial survey for the government, but their questions were awfully specific about mineral rights and water access." Caleb and Jenny exchanged glances. It was the same pattern they'd seen in Millfield Creek, the careful, legal-seeming probe that preceded Blackwood's more aggressive moves. "Then came the accidents," Mrs. Flynn continued. "The Patterson Ranch lost 50 head of cattle in a stampede that shouldn't have happened. The Mercantile had a fire that started mysteriously in the middle of a rainstorm. Old Henrik's mine shaft collapsed, even though it had been stable for 20 years. Accidents that forced people to need money," Margaret said quietly. Her banker's training let her see the pattern clearly. which makes them vulnerable to offers to buy their property. Exactly. And the offers always come from a territorial and development company with very generous terms and very little patience for negotiation. Mrs. Flynn pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket. This is the letter they sent to the town council last week. Caleb read it quickly, his jaw tightening with each line. The language was legal and polite, but the message was clear. Sell to the Mountain Vista Development Company or face federal seizure for back taxes and regulatory violations. The signatures, Jenny said, pointing to the bottom of the letter. Look at the signatures. 3 names were scrawled at the bottom, all federal officials with authority over territorial land management. Caleb recognized one of them, Marshall Dixon, the same man who'd forced him out of Millfield Creek. Blackwood's expanding his operation, he said grimly. Cedar Ridge must sit on something valuable enough to be worth this much trouble. Silver, Mrs. Flynn said simply. Henrik found a vein in his mind that assays out richer than anything in Colorado. Word got out and suddenly we had visitors. Elena stood and moved to the window, peering out at the quiet street. How long before they escalate from accidents to direct violence? Based on what happened in Millfield Creek, Caleb said. Not long, maybe a week or 2 before they bring in hired guns to make examples of anyone still refusing to sell. The room fell silent as they absorbed the implications. These women had fled one confrontation with Blackwood's corruption only to land in the middle of another. So what do we do? Margaret asked. Run again? No. Jenny's voice was firm, her green eyes blazing with determination. We make a stand. This town gave us sanctuary when we needed it. The least we can do is help them fight back. Fighting Blackwood didn't work out so well for me, Caleb pointed out, though even as he said it, he knew he was going to stay. The part of him that had worn a badge for 20 years wouldn't let him walk away from people who needed protection. You were alone then, Elena said, turning from the window with that dangerous smile. This time you have partners. Mrs. Flynn looked at each of them in turn, her expression hopeful but cautious. You folks don't owe this town anything. It's not your fight. It became our fight the moment we decided to stay, Jenny replied. The question is, does Cedar Ridge want our help? Honey, Mrs. Flynn said with a tired laugh, right now we'll take help from anybody willing to give it. Our sheriff is 63 years old and hasn't drawn his gun in anger since the Apache Wars. Our town council is mostly merchants who've never faced down hired killers. Caleb studied the faces around him. 3 women who'd already shown more courage than most men he'd known, and a frontier widow who'd survived everything the West could throw at her. It wasn't much of an army, but he'd seen what these women could do when cornered. All right, he said finally, but if we're doing this, we do it smart. No heroic gestures, no unnecessary risks. We gather information, find out exactly what Blackwood wants here, and figure out how to use that against him. Margaret smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. I may know someone who can help with that. Margaret's contact turned out to be her Uncle Thomas, a territorial judge who'd been fighting Blackwood's corruption through legal channels for the better part of 2 years, and losing badly. They met him the next morning at the hotel restaurant, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much injustice disguised as law. Judge Thomas O'Brien carried himself with the dignity of his office, but Caleb could see the frustration beneath the surface. Margaret, he said, rising to embrace his niece, when I got your telegram, I thought surely there had been some mistake. Raymond Blackwood's business partner? Papa thought it would be advantageous for the bank, Margaret replied, settling into her chair with practiced grace. He didn't ask what I thought about the arrangement. Judge O'Brien's eyes hardened. Your father always was better with numbers than with people, but that's beside the point now. He looked around the table, taking in Caleb and the other women. Mrs. Flynn tells me you folks are interested in challenging Blackwood's operations here. We're interested in stopping them, Jenny corrected. Challenging implies we're willing to lose. That earned her an appreciative look from the judge. Direct. I like that. Very well, let me explain what you're up against. He pulled out a leather portfolio and spread several documents across the table. Blackwood's operation is more sophisticated than simple land grabbing. He's created a network of shell companies, corrupt officials, and legal technicalities that make his actions appear legitimate on paper. Elena studied the papers with the sharp eye of a merchant's daughter. These subsidiary companies, they're all connected to the same territorial development fund? Exactly. And that fund is backed by Eastern investors who don't care how their profits are generated, as long as the returns are substantial. Judge O'Brien pointed to a complex diagram showing financial connections. The beauty of it, from Blackwood's perspective, is that everything appears legal. Property seizures for unpaid taxes, mineral rights transfers through federal agencies, business closures for regulatory violations, all legitimate government actions. Except the officials making those decisions are being paid by Blackwood, Caleb said. Prove it in court, the judge replied bitterly. I've been trying for 2 years. The paper trail is too clean, the witnesses too scared or too well compensated to talk. Margaret leaned forward, studying the financial diagrams. Uncle Thomas, what if we approached this differently? Instead of trying to prove corruption, what if we made the corruption unprofitable? I'm listening. Blackwood's investors expect returns. If this development project suddenly became a financial liability instead of an asset, they might pressure him to abandon it. Jenny caught on immediately. Make it cost more to steal the land than it's worth. How? Mrs. Flynn asked. She'd been quiet through most of the discussion, but her eyes were bright with interest. Elena smiled, and Caleb was beginning to recognize that particular expression as a sign of dangerous thinking. By making sure every action he takes generates expensive consequences. Legal challenges, public scrutiny, operational delays, death by 1,000 cuts. Judge O'Brien looked skeptical. That would require resources we don't have. Lawyers, investigators, political connections. We have something better, Margaret interrupted. We have inside information. I was supposed to marry one of his partners, remember? I know their business strategies, their financial weaknesses, their operational timelines. She pulled out a small notebook and began writing rapidly. Thomas Henley, my intended husband, has a gambling problem that Blackwood doesn't know about. He's been skimming from the development fund to cover his debts. Samuel Morrison, she glanced at Caleb, no relation, I assume, is having an affair with a territorial official's wife and doesn't realize Blackwood knows about it. And Jackson Ward has been selling information to competing cattle barons in Wyoming. The table fell silent as the implication sank in. You're suggesting we blackmail them, Judge O'Brien said carefully. I'm suggesting we level the playing field, Margaret replied. They've been using corruption and intimidation to steal from honest people. Perhaps it's time they experience some pressure of their own. Mrs. Flynn refilled everyone's coffee with steady hands, but Caleb could see the excitement in her expression. What would you need from the town? Information gathering mostly, people willing to watch and listen and report back. Blackwood's men will make mistakes if they think they're dealing with helpless farmers and shopkeepers. Jenny looked at Caleb. What do you think? Is it workable? Caleb studied the documents spread across the table, thinking through the tactical possibilities. It was a long shot, requiring perfect timing and more luck than he was comfortable counting on. But it was also the first plan he'd heard that didn't involve running away or getting people killed. It's risky, he said finally. If Blackwood figures out what we're doing before we're ready, he'll bring in enough firepower to level this town. Then we better make sure he doesn't figure it out, Elena said with that dangerous smile. The plan they developed over the next 3 days was ambitious, complicated, and probably insane, which made it perfect for their particular group of conspirators. Jenny would pose as a traveling teacher, documenting educational opportunities in mining communities while actually gathering intelligence on Blackwood's operations. Her school teacher credentials gave her access to families throughout the region, and her genuine interest in education provided perfect cover for asking detailed questions about local businesses and land ownership. Margaret would use her banking connections to trace the financial networks supporting Blackwood's development company, looking for vulnerabilities they could exploit. Judge O'Brien's legal expertise would help her navigate the complex web of territorial regulations and federal oversight. Elena would handle what she cheerfully called creative disruption, using her family's mercantile connections to interfere with Blackwood's supply chains and communication networks. If his hired men needed ammunition, food, or fresh horses, They'd find those resources mysteriously unavailable or prohibitively expensive. Caleb's role was the most dangerous and the most familiar. He would infiltrate Blackwood's security operation, posing as a gun for hire, looking for work. His reputation as a disgraced sheriff actually helped sell the cover story. A man with his skills and grievances would be exactly the kind of person Blackwood's lieutenants would want to recruit. The key, Judge O'Brien explained during their final planning session, is coordination. Each action has to support the others, and the timing has to be perfect. If any part of this fails, we all hang, Caleb finished. I understand the stakes. Mrs. Flynn had provided them with a base of operations in the hotel's unused third floor, complete with communication equipment and enough weapons to outfit a small militia. The other business owners in Cedar Ridge had quietly pledged their support, understanding that their town's survival depended on stopping Blackwood's expansion. The morning Jenny left for her teaching tour, she found Caleb on the hotel's front porch, cleaning his guns in the pre-dawn darkness. Second thoughts? She asked, settling into the chair beside him. Third and fourth thoughts, he admitted. This isn't like wearing a badge, Jenny. If we're wrong about any part of this, good people are going to die. Good people are already dying. Her voice was quiet but firm. Blackwood's accidents killed 3 people in the last month alone. At least this way, we're fighting back. Caleb looked at her profile in the growing light, noting the determined set of her jaw and the steady confidence in her green eyes. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a runaway bride in a torn wedding dress. Now she was planning to take on one of the most powerful men in the territory. You've changed, he said. So have you. She turned to face him fully. The man who wanted to send us away from his cabin wouldn't be sitting here planning to risk his life for a town full of strangers. Before he could respond, Elena appeared in the doorway with Margaret close behind. Both women were dressed for travel, Elena in the practical clothing of a merchant's daughter, Margaret in the conservative attire appropriate for a banker's niece visiting family. Time to go, Elena announced. Mrs. Flynn says Blackwood's advance team is expected in town this afternoon. We need to be in position before they arrive. The next hour was a blur of final preparations, equipment checks, and quiet farewells that carried the weight of uncertainty. They were splitting up with no guarantee they'd all survive to see each other again. As Jenny mounted her horse for the ride to the first mining camp on her route, she caught Caleb's eye one more time. Promise me something, she said, if I can. Promise me you'll be careful. This town needs you, but... She paused, searching for the right words. But I need you too. Before he could process the implications of that statement, she was riding away, leaving him standing in the street with Elena's knowing smile and Margaret's gentle laughter echoing behind him. 3 hours later, a dust cloud on the southern horizon announced the arrival of Blackwood's men, and Caleb Morrison prepared to become someone he'd hoped never to be again. 6 months later, Caleb stood on the front porch of the house he'd built with his own hands, watching Jenny tend to the garden she'd planted behind the white picket fence that still made him shake his head in amazement. The battle for Cedar Ridge had lasted 3 weeks and ended not with gunfire, but with federal marshals arresting Raymond Blackwood and his key associates on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and corruption. Margaret's financial investigation had provided the evidence. Elena's disruption tactics had forced Blackwood's men into desperate mistakes, and Caleb's infiltration had given them access to the communication records that proved the conspiracy. Judge O'Brien had called it the most sophisticated law enforcement operation he'd ever witnessed, orchestrated entirely by people who'd had no legal authority to investigate anything. Jenny straightened from her tomato plants, brushing dirt from her hands and smiling at him with the same warmth that had been slowly healing the wounded places in his heart. They'd married 2 months ago in the little church at the end of Main Street, with Elena and Margaret as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Margaret had opened a small bank in Cedar Ridge, using her father's connections and her own expertise to provide honest financial services to the growing community. She'd never married, claiming she was too busy building an empire to bother with romance, though Caleb had noticed Judge O'Brien's nephew making frequent trips to town. Elena had surprised everyone by establishing a trading post that quickly became the most successful business in 3 counties. Her ability to negotiate, combined with her family's connections, had made her wealthy in her own right. She'd also never married, though she entertained a steady stream of suitors with the same dangerous smile that had once convinced Bull Hensley to take her deal. "Caleb Morrison," Jenny called from the garden, "are you going to stand there daydreaming all day, or are you going to help me with these vegetables?" He walked down the porch steps, still marveling at how naturally domestic life had come to him. The badge he'd worn for 20 years had been replaced by a carpenter's tools and a farmer's almanac, and he'd never been happier. "I was thinking," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she knelt among the tomato plants. Dangerous habit, but she leaned back against him, content. About how 3 runaway brides changed everything. Jenny turned in his arms, her green eyes bright with laughter. "Not 3 runaway brides, Caleb Morrison. 3 women who decided they were tired of running." A rider appeared on the horizon, approaching fast from the direction of town. Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward his gun belt before he recognized Mrs. Flynn's grandson on his bay mare. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison," the boy called as he reined in beside their gate. "Mrs. Flynn says you need to come quick. There's been another telegram from the territorial governor." Caleb and Jenny exchanged glances. In the 6 months since Blackwood's arrest, they'd received 3 commendations from territorial officials, 2 job offers from federal law enforcement, and 1 marriage proposal from a cattle baron's widow who'd apparently heard about Caleb's heroics secondhand. "What does it say this time?" Jenny asked. The boy handed over the yellow telegram with the excitement of someone delivering momentous news. Caleb read it quickly, then started laughing. "What?" Jenny demanded. "The territorial governor," Caleb said, still chuckling, "wants to know if we'd be interested in consulting on a corruption investigation in Wyoming. Apparently some cattle barons there are using tactics that remind him of the Blackwood case." Jenny plucked the telegram from his hands, read it herself, and then looked at him with raised eyebrows. "Are you